Game face on, Joe.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the often imitated, never duplicated, slightly inebriated D Infinity Live, your multi-platform, multi-publisher, online live gaming supplement. I am your host, William Big T Thrasher. With me, as always, is Michael Jolly Varhola, Brandon the Madman Cass, and our very special guest tonight from Comicpalooza, Mr. Joe Charles. Say hi, everybody.
Hi,
Hello.
everybody.
All right, and tonight our topic is world building, the biggest, bulkiest part, and often, in my experience, funnest part of game and campaign setting design. But before we get into our main topic, we do have a couple of things to go over. Brendan, why don't you tell us what's happening on our website, d-infinity.com?
Excellent. Yes, so over on d-infinity.net, we have a post. .net. We'll pick up .com when the weird Japanese website that owns d-infinity.com lets go of it.
That is not our hentai.
That's exactly right. So, no, I'm serious though. It's a weird Japanese website. Anyways, d-infinity.net. We have a post detailing all 40 of our Comicpalooza events, and as we get closer to Comicpalooza, that event listing will become more and more important to you, because if you are planning on going to that convention, it is your Bible for getting on board with Skirmisher events. It's got links that take you right to the registration page for each one of those events. So if you're going to Comicpalooza, you would be remiss to not register yourself for one of the Skirmisher's events. We're doing a bunch of different stuff, one of which was written about, the preparation for which was written about by Clint Staples, our resident expert on medieval warfare, arms and armor, and prolific and well-known miniature sculptor. He's preparing to demo in the Skirmisher Games Pavilion at Comicpalooza the miniatures game Chevauché. So he's working on some Viking-related skirmish miniature sessions in that game system. And he is sculpting and painting and working very hard on the scenario. So definitely read that to see all the effort that goes into our preparation for these events, and you can more or less use that as a rule for how much preparation goes into the rest of our events, because it's really true. We care a lot about what we're doing. I mean, Will, he does all of our live action stuff, and he can definitely he knows how much effort goes into it.
Yeah, if you saw how much energy we have to pour into these events, you would pass out from exhaustion.
Yeah, it's amazing. You look at what Clint has done in that article where he's talking about Saga of the Worm's Son. So he's running 4 Saga of the Worm's Son miniatures events. But, I mean, we're just so lucky that Clint's our friend. He also just happens to be a world-class sculptor who's sculpted for Reaper, Armor Cast, Lance and Laser. So he's actually doing a bunch of originally his sculpted figures and doing a lot of original painting and doing a lot of original mods, and he did his own Chevauché rules modifications. So he's putting together a completely original miniatures game and just coming down from Canada and running it for us for 4 days. So I mean, and he's doing that represents just 10% of our listings. We've got just a ton of other stuff as well. Lucas Purier is going to be running Quactica for us. John Kadolf and 3 or 4 people at any given time are going to be running our 900-square-foot Little Orc Wars game. So we have just got so much planned. 40 Skirmisher gaming events listed, including the D-Infinity Pavilion of Many Games, which will be card games and board games that have appeared in the magazine. So I think we're doing 120 GM hours of gaming, which is like 1,000 player hours of gaming over the 4 days of Comicpalooza.
Excellent. And Mike, is there anything going on with Skirmisher? Aside from what we've already covered with Little Orc Wars.
What is going on with Skirmisher? We are doing nothing but preparing games for Comicpalooza. We have 2 other things going on. We have a basic version of the Little Orc Wars rules, H.G. Wells' Little Orc Wars, which is the miniatures game of ours that uses live catapult fire to resolve melee. So everybody loves this game. Everybody thinks this game is just great. This is the game that we're going to be running over at least a 900 square foot area at Comicpalooza. But anyone who's interested in picking up the rules, they are available at Drive-Thru-RPG. And we will be releasing an expanded version of the rules on Tuesday. So what's up there right now is like, 20 or 25 pages. What we're going to release on Tuesday is a 54-page expanded version of the rules. Anyone who buys the rules at the cheap version that's up there right now will automatically get the full expanded version for free when we release it on Tuesday. So it's a $2 rule set today. It's a $5 rule set as of Tuesday, and you can get it for $2 today. You buy it today. You'll get the expanded version on Tuesday. And then we're going to be releasing that in print. That'll be available as a print book at Comicpalooza. It'll be released in print for the first time at Comicpalooza. So that's what we've got in the works. Oh, and The Infinity Volume number 6, which we'll release in PDF format next week on Drive-Thru-RPG. And once again, as we've done the last 2 years, in print for the first time at Comicpalooza.
Excellent. And speaking of Comicpalooza, now I want to officially welcome our special guest to the show, Joe Charles from Comicpalooza.
Hello. It's good to be here.
Joe. And Joe, what can you tell us about what you do with Comicpalooza?
Well, I am the gaming coordinator, so I assemble a staff of loyal minions, and together we try to recruit as many game masters as we can for various games. And so we have everything from your skirmisher games. I know we've got some of your Kettle of Fish Productions LARPs. We've got tons of RPGs, miniatures games, board games, lots of stuff. What do you want to hear about first?
Now, I don't count as a minion, do I? I always thought of myself as sort of a soulless but enthusiastic Ronin. Isn't that really a more apt description?
Well, probably so, yeah. I mean, you are involved in other things, so...
I just wanted to make sure we were square on that.
Right. No, but I do have individual people that help me oversee the different areas, RPGs, for example. But I can tell you a little bit about what we have this year. One of the new things that we have is we have our independent game alley. So we have a number of independent game developers that are going to be up near the game hall on the 3rd floor. They'll be demoing their games all weekend, and you can chat with them and try their games, and they'll also be auctioning off, well, not auctioning, but raffling off a copy of each of the games that they demo there. We've also got a charity tournament for X-Wing. It benefits the Wounded Warrior Project. We're going to be running that on Sunday. Fantasy Flight has sent us some nice prize support for that. You can get some old transports or Tantive 4, which are their new larger ships. And we've got plenty of other X-Wing events throughout the weekend. A couple other tournaments, some mega events, a really nice custom Hoth scenario. We've got Etten Games bringing in a board game library for us, so we'll have tons of board games there. We've got a couple local clubs running board games for us. We've got other stores that are helping us again this year. 8th Dimension has been a big supporter. They're running their LARP Night on Earth, which we ran last year, which was very popular. It's a life-size version of the Last Night on Earth board game by Flying Frog. They're also running some Star Trek Attack Wing events. We've got Magic the Gathering again. We've got War Machine War of the Stores back. We've got Steve Jackson's Men in Black. Odds are, if you're looking for it, we probably have it somewhere.
Excellent.
Sorry, Will.
Oh, I was wondering, is there any special event that's on the schedule that's really jumping out for you?
Well, for me personally, I like the X-Wing event to benefit the Wounded Warrior Project. Not only it's a charity event, so we do ask for a donation for people to play in it, but it's got some really nice prize support, and Comicpalooza is actually going to also donate $5 for every person that enters the tournament. So cool. We're hoping we can raise some money for them.
That's pretty good. And you were doing some things this year, Joe, that are completely new for Comicpalooza. but also pretty unique as far as any convention I've ever seen. So the board game library, we've seen that at Gen Con. So I think doing that for the first time ever at Comicpalooza this year, right?
That I'm aware of, yes.
Yeah, so that's brilliant. But I've never seen anybody do anything to showcase the efforts of independent game publishers at a convention like you're doing. I think that is pretty unique. What sparked your desire to include that?
Well, we had a lot of feedback from our independent game developers, and basically they had a need to reach their audience, and we want to help them do that. So Artist Alley and the Dealer Hall are a little too far removed from games because, as you know, at Comicpalooza we've got a ton of space. The George R. Brown is about 1.2 million square feet, I think. And got about 900,000 of that. So
a lot.
Yeah, so if you locate the independent game developers downstairs in the Dealer Hall or with the Artist Alley, the gamers don't typically walk past them. We wanted to increase their traffic, so we've moved them up to the 3rd floor. And we've put them out in one of the pre-function areas along the balcony so that they can also get some traffic from general attendance that's coming up to see the panels that are in the main presentation area. So really it's just that they do so much to help us in terms of bringing in new content. They preview new games, and we want to help them out. We want to help them reach their audience, and we hadn't really been doing that with the Artist Alley and the Dealer Hall. So we're going to give this a try and see how it does for them.
Excellent. Well, are there any final thoughts you want to leave our viewers with for Comicpalooza before we move on to our main topic?
Well, I would point out that we have had a couple of generous offers, one from Skirmisher and one from D3 Adventures, to give away some free product to anybody that pre-registers for a game on our site and then shows up and actually plays in that game. So right there is a chance to get some really nice product just for showing up and playing a game that you were going to play anyway.
If you're registered in advance.
If you're registered. You got to pre-register.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very cool. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for our main topic, which is world building. We've got a lot of interesting questions from our viewers that we want to get to, but just right off the bat, I'd like us to go around and everybody give just your kind of basic philosophy on world building. And my philosophy just comes down to two things. The world's got to be a fun world you want to adventure in, and it has to not make too much sense. And I'll get into more specifics later, but I like my worlds to be a little bit confusing. Now, how about you, Mike?
I sort of fall back on Gary Gygax's philosophy that he really instilled in me when he and I were working on a number of projects together, particularly what became the City Builder book, Nation Builder. Those were projects that I worked on with Gary, and really his philosophy was that the core of a game world needs to be pretty familiar to the players. Having players playing characters that are just from a different culture is difficult and alien enough to get them into those roles. And if you want to really, really include weird stuff, you need to do it progressively as you move out from the core of the game world. So that's a philosophy that I try not to be too meta with. I try not to let it be too obvious to the players when they're playing, but the place where your characters start off from is generally going to be pretty familiar. Your characters are going to be from a traditional fantasy game world, a traditional fantasy game setting, and they're going to be from traditional races and traditional classes. And then as you move outward from that area to the outlying islands or the mainlands or new nations or new continents, then you're going to encounter increasingly weird peoples, races, cultures, political systems, options for your own characters. So that's sort of onion philosophy is sort of my philosophy when it comes to world building, and that is something that I can thank Gary for, because he allowed me to sort of put that into cohesive terms.
Very cool. How about you, Joe?
Well, I like what Michael said, but I also like for my game world to have a certain cohesiveness. I want it, even if it's not necessarily important to the players all the time, I like to know how the different factions interact with each other, how the different rulers interact with each other, so that any sort of action that they take in one area can have repercussions then throughout the game world if you need it to. And I also favor a very sort of non-plot hook method of sending my players through the world. And so I don't necessarily have, say, a starter area for the characters to start in. There is obviously an area that they start in, but there are going to be challenges in that area that are going to be above their head, and it's up to them to be smart enough not to get in over their head. So I think that helps to lend a certain realness to the world. Very
cool. How about you, Brendan?
So when I'm building worlds, I tend to fall back on one originating technique, which is starting with the question of what if. So, to use an example that some of us might be familiar with in Swords of Coast, it's what if after this eruption of the volcano happened, that then there was magic and titans and all these things, and these cultures continued a little bit longer than what they continued into in real life. So you start off with that question of what if, and go from there. For example, I've used generally less is more in this case, something really fundamental. In a sci-fi setting, I use the question of what if the internet, in addition to just sending electrons, right, which is what it does now, also could send protons and neutrons, right? So effectively you have all of the building blocks for matter, right? So you send packets of matter, not just packets of photons of light. So I started from there, and then I built out from there, right? And ended up with an Internet of Things, which is a term now, which is for the industrial internet, but that has nothing to do with what I ended up doing. But yeah, so that ended up being an interesting concept because you had people hacking on chairs, right? You'd hack the chair, or you'd be able to download a car, just like the MPAA says you'd never download a car. Well, you would if you could. So they do.
Give it a few more years.
Right.
You would if you could.
Would if you could.
Very cool. Well, we've got a lot of questions and comments for our viewers, so I kind of wanted to dive straight into that. And our first comes from a friend of the show, Lucas Priere, who wants to know, how do you deal with the world that has 20 to 30 or more sentient races when our own known world currently only has one, and at most had 3? I think he's referring to Neanderthals and whatnot. I pronounce it Neanderthal, damn it.
Fine.
That's okay. No one's getting after you, Will.
I'm so used to people trying to correct me, even though that's the correct pronunciation. I just get very, very knee-jerk defensive about it.
Well, I'm ultra-liberal, and Joe's a scientist, and Brendan speaks German, so nobody's going to harass you for saying Neanderthal.
No.
Oh, excellent.
I can't even pronounce THs.
Well, you're doing pretty well when you talk to me, so I think that's nice.
Right.
Well, I guess my own stance. I think when you're going to have that many different races or cultures, if it's just different cultures in your world, the more cultures and races you have in your world, the faster you need to be able to describe them to somebody who's never played the game before. Because I actually ran a sci-fi campaign where I had written up the 20 or so different aliens that kind of ruled the section of space the game took place in, and that was kind of what I did. Is the race listing was just like a really quick 2-sentence description of every race, and the more detailed descriptions I would leave only if the player wanted more. So, if the description was they're like dinosaurs and they're always hungry, and oh, that sounds interesting, then I'll give them the full spiel about that race. If the description is they're cat people but made out of dark matter, and that sounds interesting, that's what I will flesh out for the other players' descriptions. But I feel like the more stuff there is, the faster you need to be able to explain it. And those explanations need to be evocative or make a kind of sense. I know I talk a lot about Fading Suns, but that's always how I break down the aliens. Oh, the Oban, they're Buddhist Vulcans. oh, the Ukar, they're Pictish samurai, and there you go. That's those groups boiled down, and you can go from there. How about you, Mike?
How do I address sentient races? A couple of different ways. I mean, he asked a good question, so it's certainly something. Even if you're going to just sort of dismiss the question, I think at least asking it first and contemplating it is important. I do that a couple of ways. One, when I have studied Indian mythology, the mythology of Hinduism and the Indian subcontinent, you have all these different mythological races that are spawned from the activities of different deities. So if a deity's in a battle and he gets cut and his blood hits the ground, then little avatars that look like whatever form he was in when he was fighting that battle spring up from the ground. So this actually works very well in a fantasy world where the divine is real, where deities are real. So if deities are real, basically you can account for any number of races as just being products of their activity. Okay, so the traditional gods might have created humanity. Well, then you might get, say, evil deities saying, well, this is what the gods of light created. I'm going to go ahead and create hobgoblins. So you just say, well, all goblinoids are created as a product of such and such a side pantheon for forbidden deities. Or what we used to call giant class humanoids in D&D, orcs and giants and ogres, they are Titan spawn. This is what we say in the Swords of Coast fantasy campaign setting. How do we account for orcs and all the giants? Well, basically, they are just the degenerate offspring of the great Titans. That's what they are. Orcs are just giants. They just happen to be human-sized giants. They are human-sized manifestations of what the Titans are. So orcs, ogres, giants, they're all just Titan spawn. So we account for them that way. And then as far as what Lucas says about, well, you know, we only had 3 races in our world. From a scientific point of view, we only had 3 races. We only have 3 verifiable biological races today. But in the folklore of Earth, we've had many, many more than 3 races. So the dwarves and the elves and the gnomes and the kobolds, those are all products of human folklore, of real, actual human mythology. So the way I justify that in the campaign world I'm developing now, the Swords of Coast fantasy campaign setting, is we say, well, those are older races that had just sort of started drifting into obscurity. They had retreated to subterranean lairs, or they'd almost died out, or they'd gotten integrated with humanity. And now with this great cataclysm, they've been reawoken and they've come back out into the world. So that's a couple of ways, I think, to address many, many races in a fantasy setting.
Very cool. How about you, Joe?
Just how to address multiple races?
Well, how to address like 20 or more, like a huge like milieu of different playable races.
Well, I think I don't know. I think Michael covered it pretty well. I tend to fall back on some of the old fantasy settings. You know, you got Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk, and there's, I mean, everything's intelligent in those settings. From your goblinoids to your various humans, you've got treants, you've got intelligent spiders, you've got everything. So I tend to fall back on those and look at how they handled it and take some inspiration there. Certainly you can take inspiration from folklore like Michael was talking about, or you can just come up with something crazy on your own. But I mean, it's pretty easy to populate them in the world. I'm not quite sure what the question is asking in terms of.
I think he's asking, how do you justify the existence of so many sentient races when our own real experience does not allow for that many? I think that's what he's asking.
Well, I suppose in that case I'd have to taunt him a little bit for trying to bring reality into a fantasy setting, but since I don't know him that well, I won't do that.
We'll be running games for you, Joe, just so you know. He's running all of our Quactica games.
All right. Well, yeah, I mean, certainly having a pantheon of gods, which is fairly common in fiction. You can have each of the gods that's created various races.
Yeah.
you know, if you're dealing in science fiction, you can have races that come from different planets. You know, there's good examples of lots of different aliens on different planets. So, you know, I tend to just take my inspiration from literature and movies and previous game settings.
Very cool. How about you, Brendan?
So I take a kind of, you know, holistic, sort of anthropological kind of perspective when it comes to sentient races. And you know, you have to think back. You know, you've got races of people, like the pygmies, for example, that look very different than you or I. They happen to be human. The origin of calling another people by a different race, well, I mean, we've got that, right? We've got you know, Asian folks, we've got Europeans, pygmies. All these people are different races. They just don't have the same kind of magical background that you get from like elves or dwarves or orcs. But you know, I've met some people who I think could have inspired orcs, just in pure appearance and maybe even demeanor. So when you think of it that way, if human beings, this is again another what if question, right? That I like to fall back on with world building. If you ask the question, what if human beings weren't quite as pervasive and didn't migrate quite as much, then you would get like these pockets, right, of human beings that evolved in a different environment, and then certain mutations would become prevalent. You get a little if the world were older, for example,
divergent evolution,
right? If human beings were an older species, given enough time, you would get you'd get the speciation that would cause maybe things like pointed ears, because who knows, maybe that genetic thing causes better hearing in an environment where you need better hearing. Or you get smaller, stouter people, because if they live in caves, for example, like dwarves, being tall isn't a benefit. It's actually detrimental, because you still need to be strong enough to lift rocks, but you don't want to be too tall because the caves are small, right? Moving more rock is a disadvantage. So if you're shorter, you move less. So all of these things can have a common root, you know, a scientific root. So if you're worried about explaining how these things, these separate sentient races evolved in your world, and you're concerned with their origin and making it make sense, well, you don't need to be overly concerned, because an elf need not be overly different of a description of a race than the term Asian or the term European or Hispanic or anything like that. It's just that they have traits that make them elves, right? And we already know that these well, not all of them, but in many games, D20 for example, you have half-orcs, right? So how could these species interbreed unless they had a common ancestor? So you don't need to look at them as really separate, like, species that evolved from different trees, right? They could have a common ancestor.
So you'd say an orc, an elf, a dwarf, if you wanted to justify their existence, you could say, well, they all come from the same rootstock. They're just specialized exactly versions of people. There are people, some of whom we call humans, some of whom we call dwarves, etc.
In some games, they're the ancients, you know, whatever you want to call them, some precursor race. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned, like, you know, like species diverging and you know, being able to interbreed in a fantasy setting. I just wanted to give a real quick shout out to Midnight, which was an old D20 setting from Fantasy Flight Games, which took the time to actually sort of lay out, like, they went beyond having like half orcs and half elves. In that campaign setting, all of the different fantasy races could interbreed, and you could play any of those crossbreeds. And they went into a lot of wonderful biological and cultural detail about what it meant if, like, your father was a dwarf and your mother was an orc, and whether or not certain crossbreeds could still reproduce, or whether they were mules. It was very well thought out. I thought that was fantastic. That was something I would like to see in general more attention paid to in games. There are multiple intelligent species or races. Is, you know, what happens when they fall in love and have children. I think it's like Midnight and Fading Suns, again, are one of the only two that have gone into any detail about this.
All right, have we got a question that ties in with some completely different aspect of world building?
Actually, we have one from Mike Eaton, who wants to know, where does the canon in the written material and your world begin? How far is too far? Well, as I've said before, my general policy whenever I sit down to run a game is I tell all my players, don't assume anything outside of the core rulebook is canon. And you know, I do that because lots of settings get too big and too convoluted for what I want to do with them. You know, you kind of want to manage what stuff from, for lack of a better term, the expanded universe is going to be in your game, because you never know when the player's going to choose that one thing for their character that you forgot was in that supplement you said was canon, and that it has devastating effects on the rest of the campaign. But beyond that, I think doing like what ifs with established settings is perfectly viable. I mean, you know, I once did a D&D game where the premise was it's a D&D, but the game takes place the day after all magic stopped working across the world, and then all the magic rules were ditched because none of them applied, because no one could cast or prepared spells from that point. And it didn't break the game, but it did drastically change the way people played, and that's the main thing. I think you can change, no matter how integral you think something is to a setting, you can change it or you can remove it. You just have to be on your toes and be ready to deal with any consequence that change has. Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I don't know if there's really something that I would consider too far in terms of changing or altering a game setting. I mean, it's really about whether or not you and your players are able to have fun with the setting, whether or not you enjoy it. So, you know, I tend to keep most of my settings, honestly, in the more traditional fantasy-based realm. But you know, it's fun to take a step outside of that sometimes and play what-if scenarios. So, I'm sorry, Michael, did you say something?
No, I just agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Although, did you have a thought on this topic, Mike?
I approach canon from a completely different point of view because we're involved in game development perpetually, and we've got our own fantasy campaign setting, the Swords of Coast fantasy campaign setting. So I don't look at this campaign setting as if it was something that I bought in a store and I'm trying to figure out how to shoehorn my game into it. It's our campaign setting. So basically, when we make decisions about canon, we're making decisions not about what we're doing with our home game in the context of the campaign setting. We're making decisions about what the canon of the published campaign setting is going to be. So I think our experience is a little different than what it is for most people. Most people are going to buy a campaign setting like ours, and then they're going to say, how do I make this work for my game? What we've done with the campaign setting, however, is try to make it compatible with any kind of traditional fantasy game, and leave a lot of gray areas that allow people to customize the setting for their own storylines or whatever. So on the one hand, we're developing canon ourselves. On the other, we're trying to make it possible for people to use our campaign setting in a way that is compatible with the game in particular that they want to be playing.
Brendan?
So, you know, I don't really feel it's particularly necessary for anyone to feel particularly beholden to any canon. Use as much or as little of it as you want as inspiration. You know, sometimes you'll get some pushback from your players if they're expecting a certain campaign. You're going to have to keep in mind the audience that you're playing with. If you modify it too much when they're expecting Star Wars and you get rid of the Force, right? You know, then they might be a little bit confused by that. Actually, Star Wars minus the Force, that's probably what, Firefly, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, you know, use as much or as little as what, you know, of what works for you, and then, you know, take it in your own direction to be creative with. There's no real limit to that, so long as it's still understandable. And you have to worry with any world building. This is a general tip. It doesn't even have to do with modifying a campaign setting that you've purchased. You have to make sure you're not getting convoluted. Too many nested if statements. It'll get way too convoluted, and you might start losing people. So your best bet, explain it to someone who's willing to listen to you talk about your campaign setting. Don't do it to me. I'll probably not be able to follow you, but find someone who's willing to listen to your campaign setting, and if you can't give them an elevator pitch on it that they understand, it's probably gone too far.
Good point.
And actually, that's something I wanted to bring up about going too far, and this is just something that a piece of advice I really want to get out there. Make sure whatever campaign setting you make, whatever world you build, make sure it contains at least one thing you really don't like. This will help keep your sort of world focused and interesting. There is no game world more unfun to play with than a game world that only contains everything the creator thought was cool at the time.
Right.
I always find those campaign settings very bland, very boring, and in many ways very soulless. It's like what Joel Hodgson said: when you take everything you think is cool and put it in one room all at once, you'll feel very empty, and that's what those settings feel like to me.
I will say something that's peripheral to that sort of dovetails with that, and that it's some projects really do benefit from multiple people working on them. I'm a pretty good writer. This is what I do. I'm a good game designer. I mean, these are things that I've published widely on and I'm pretty good at. But I have to tell you, when I work on a project like the Swords of Coast fantasy campaign setting or Lives of Coast, which is the biographies of the major characters, I just sit back and I say, wow, I'm so glad I'm working with these other guys on this. I'm glad I'm working with Will or Brendan or Jim Clooney or Clint Staples. I'm glad I'm working with these other guys because they come up with things that I never would have thought of. And it really just makes the whole setting much richer. So there might be someone out there who can wholesale create a world that's going to be rich and vibrant and completely 4 or 5 dimensional, completely from themselves. But I find that the projects that I'm involved in benefit from collaboration from like-minded people, and that we get a better product, a better end result from working together on these things. So I would say that sort of peripheral to the point you made, Will.
Oh, very cool. And we have another question here from friend of the show Heath, who wants to know where do you go, or where do we get the line between world building and world altering? Where do you draw the line? And his example being, I've created a world that's exactly like Kryn, except the humans all have blue eyes. I think if you're ever working with a world that is based on another world, whatever you change has to be goddamn huge. Like I have seen a lot of people who will show me their original campaign setting, and all it is Middle Earth or Niwan or Kryn or Greyhawk with the most superficial change, like the barbarians live on the equator instead of in the Northlands.
Or everything is just unpronounceable. They just make up a bunch of unpronounceable words, but it's the same old crap. You just can't pronounce it.
Oh yeah, and like the really good campaign settings I find that are clearly sort of inspired by more established campaign settings, the change that is made is gigantic. Once again, talking about Midnight, the setting is almost exactly Middle Earth, except Sauron Sauron won, and the Fellowship of the Rings now works for him. That's what it is, but the serial numbers are completely
Well, you know
different.
what? I don't want to be a hater here. Actually, I don't mind being a hater, but I know somebody's going to get pissed at me. I blame Terry Brooks for this. I mean, this phenomenon that you're describing, this started in the 1980s. Basically, what's the point of the drill? You take a quality product like, say, The Lord of the Rings. You don't have to like Lord of the Rings, but it's a quality product, okay? If you don't like it, you have to look within yourself to determine why you don't like it. And then you do this reverse alchemy. You basically take something that's made out of gold and you transform it into a turd. This is Shannara. Shannara is the turdification of Lord of the Rings. It's taking something great and transforming it into shit. And that sort of set a standard for some people. They looked at this and they said, oh, this is the way it's done. You take something that's great and wonderful and you just sort of fuck it up a little, and I've got something new. So I really think that he is an evil element in the zeitgeist that has produced this phenomena that you're describing, Will. Going back 30 years.
Oh, yeah. Joe, do you have anything to say on this?
Well, I would just say that I really see world altering and world building as two different means to an end. But like you said, you do have to be very careful. If you're going to start with an existing world and alter it, you better pick something pretty substantial to change. Otherwise, you might as well just play with the setting that you're trying to alter. But yeah, I mean, I can build something out of Legos, and then I can take that something and change it into something totally different, or I could start with a new set of Legos and build that new thing out of my unassembled Legos. So either way, I can get to the same point. It's just a matter of what works for you.
But if you make it out of Duplo blocks, it will suck. So I think there's got to be a metaphor.
Or Mega Blocks.
And there's something to be said for world altering. I had one campaign that ended one time when the entire party got killed. So I essentially took that campaign world and said, okay, what happens now that the heroes lose and evil wins? And by the way, here's your next campaign, and this is where you start. So, sometimes it's fun.
I like your Lego metaphor because I tend to look at world building or world altering in a similar way. If you want to be creative, if you want to be original, you have to go through the creative process in a non-sham way. I mean, creative people are inspired by other people, right? They get Lego blocks from other sets. They pull those Lego blocks from other sets and then they combine them into something of their own. You can see those trace elements, right, that came from those other campaign settings. But when you put it all together, that's your own. That's the essence of Legos, and that's the essence of world building. You can be inspired by other things. Swords of Kos is a classical Greek setting. It is heavily inspired by it. However, it also has elements from the mythos. So you can see the influence of the mythos there, big time. It also has Franz Lieber and other swords and sorcery authors heavily influencing it. So what you end up with isn't H.P. Lieber's Swords of Kos. It is Skirmisher Swords of Kos. You do end up with something original, and there is nothing wrong with being inspired by other elements. But if
making them your own.
If you take all of the same pieces and you paint them a different color, it's altering, right?
Right.
This is cross genre. If you take a car, right, and you paint it a different color, you've altered it. You just look at it that way. Color is an easy one, but even putting a body kit on it, still the same car, right? Needs to be put together fundamentally different. That's when you end up with world building.
And actually,
So
more than just
that's a good metaphor, Joe.
Legos is really apt, and related to that, there's something fun with just taking two ideas and ramming them into each other as hard as they'll go and seeing if they stick. There are lots of great campaign settings out there that are just two other things combined.
The Large Hadron Collider Theory of World Building by
Oh,
William.
yeah, exactly. I mean, and it works with anything. You know, talk about the Cthulhu mythos. There's a scenario I've been working on called What Ho El Hazred, which is what if the collected works of the Cthulhu mythos were combined with the collected works of humorist P.G. Wodehouse, and it's all upper class twits who, while trying to get out of their arranged marriages, discover books of eldritch lore, and end up accidentally preventing the end of the world.
That's excellent.
Yeah, just because that type of horror and that type of humor are nothing alike, but
Right.
when you slam them together, this beautiful friction is created.
That is funny.
Oh, and Mike, I wanted to join you on your 5 minutes hate there, because I wanted to bring up.
Take a full 5 minutes of hate. I don't think I've had 5 minutes of hate in the whole damn show, Will. But go on. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that you might join in on this one. I did want to talk about worlds that are over-designed. You know, worlds that are, and this is why I said your setting shouldn't make too much sense. Because when a world is too much of a piece of clockwork, that there's just no room in those moving parts for anyone to have adventures or for interesting conflicts to happen, that's a bad game world. And what I always hold up is my example of this is a TQML, The Empire of the Petal Throne by M.A.R. Barker. That is a wonderful world, but it's a terrible campaign setting. There's nothing to do in that world. It is so loaded with minute details about how every little thing works. There's no gaps for adventure to happen.
It's a good point.
It's a great point, Will, because at that point, you and your players are not exploring a world anymore. You're experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that's okay if you're reading a book or you're watching a TV show or a movie. That's an experience. You should be exploring it. There needs to be gaps, because and even if you're designing your own world, I totally agree with you. Even if it's a from scratch, you've designed this world, if you've written it all out so that there is no exploration in the byplay between you and your players,
right?
Why are you even playing the game at that point? Write a novel. Just write a novel. And you have to be careful as a GM. Don't if your writing is too shit to write a novel, and so you're instead trying to put it all into a campaign setting, your players are just going to suffer through it. So yeah, I agree. It should have gaps. There should be places where collaboratively you can paint that picture as well. You just need the scaffolding, right?
Yep.
The rules that make things work, so that you can figure it out together.
Yep.
Joe, did you want to weigh in on this?
Well, yeah, I agree. You don't want to over detail it. You do need the gaps. I like to know how things work together, but that isn't to say that you need to detail it down to the finest bit of minutia, right? You just need the big picture so that you can referee the world.
Yep.
It's the difference between going to a theme park frontier town or actually going camping, to me, right?
Good
I mean,
point.
you don't want to experience a theme park. You want to go out in the wilderness and actually, have some adventure and find something that no one else has seen. You don't want to feel like you're. Forgotten Realms was one that was really bad for me. I loved the setting, but I didn't always like playing in the setting because everything had been detailed. You knew who all the big players were and what the history was going to be.
Right.
And you felt a little bit like you couldn't impact the world.
Right.
Yeah, and actually, you bring up like the sort of established heroes in that campaign setting. If you're going to have established heroes that are already operating in your campaign setting, you better give them. You need to give them, I think, limited roles, because another thing that's terrible is when you're adventuring in a world where your own players' characters feel redundant.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
you never, that's one of the difficulties with playing in an established setting like Middle Earth or Star Wars, where we already know the heroes from the source material.
Right.
So whenever you put your own heroes into it, you really have to work hard to find a place where they can do their own heroic things, and these NPCs won't steal their thunder.
Will, is that only true in high fantasy? Because if you're playing a low fantasy setting, your problems are much smaller. So if you try to play a high fantasy setting in Star Wars, for example, your impact can't be bigger than Luke's, right? If you play a high fantasy setting in the Lord of the Rings, your impact can't be bigger than Gollum's. So, so is it a problem that you only get in high fantasy campaign settings, and something that can be alleviated if you're playing in a low fantasy campaign setting, or do you think it's still a problem?
Well, I think. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, I'm just agreeing. I don't have anything to add. I just agree with Brendan. I think he makes an excellent point.
Well, I think with low fantasy, the hero's actions very rarely change the fundamental nature of the world they're in. Like at the end of a successful adventure with Fafford the Grey Mouser, when their successful adventure ends, their enemy is dead, and they've got some extra coins in their pocket.
Well, they're happy to break even.
Oh yeah, they're happy to break even, which is one of the great things about low fantasy. You can have an epic adventure all about enough money to buy your next meal.
Right.
It doesn't have to be about the collapse of the world.
Yeah. High fantasy is about saving the world. Swords and sorcery fantasy is about paying the rent. And the way I've explained the difference is that people will say, okay, well, what's the difference between these? Well, at high fantasy, you care about the story. You care about the story. The world's going to end. The world's going to end. And then because you care about the mission, then secondarily you end up caring about the characters. Why do we care about these characters? Because they're the ones that have to perform this lofty mission. You go from the complete opposite direction with swords and sorcery. You have to care about the characters first, because their missions are all just shit. They're trying to escape bounty hunters, or rob a tomb, or escape from a cave that collapsed. I mean, they're not world-shattering missions. You only care about the mission in Swords and Sorcery because you care about the character. So the author, the game designer, the storyteller has to approach these from completely different points of view. Tolkien just has to say, the great Dark Lord, who's a proxy for Satan, he's going to just ruin everything unless heroes step up. And they say, oh my God, look at the heroes, they're great. I love them because they're going to do this thing that the author talked about. But what if you introduce those heroes first? You've got to make the reader fall in love with the heroes, and then they care about the mission that they're going about on, which is not saving the world in Swords and Sorcery.
Actually, Joe, did you have something to say on this?
No, I was just nodding my head in agreement.
Something even related to that, this goes into having sort of powerful pre-existing heroes. One of the reasons why you kind of need to put some limitations on those is that I don't know everyone I know who's played Dragonlance. They always have, they tell you about the games they've played in, there's a story that I inevitably hear, which is at some point they come across some crisis and decide, oh, well, let's just find Elminster. He'll take care of this.
Right.
You never want your heroes to be so awesome, so public, and so accessible that the PCs will abandon their quest to find that hero to finish the quest that they just abandoned.
Third Death Star, just find Luke.
But it can be fun to take some of those high fantasy settings and introduce some characters and then allow them to run amok and almost as an alternate timeline.
Sure. Okay, well that's a good point. That's a different thing altogether.
Yeah. What if the heroes didn't save the day and now your characters have to live in this timeline?
Right.
That's actually very true. I used to do a lot of superhero gaming set in both the Marvel and the DC universe. And the best GMs I had for those games would, usually start the game with, okay, it's this comic universe just like it exists today, except all the top level heroes are gone. They were all killed. They all left the Earth to fight some galactic threat, but all the heavy hitters were removed, and that took all that pressure off the campaign. It was fantastic and created its own different kind of world.
Yep.
Oh, we've got another question from Lucas Priere, who wants to know: is there any good software or apps for use in world building, and do you use any? And I guess for me, the only software I use is a word processor. I'm very old fashioned. I just use a blank sheet of paper, a pencil, and my imagination, and that's how I build my worlds. Anything else is just a window dressing. But for all I know, I'm in the minority. How about the rest of you?
Well,
I don't use any apps, but I use what I use more than any other one single thing when I'm doing world building, because our world is set in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey, mainland Greece, North Africa, Egypt. I use Google Maps. Google Maps is a great resource and really shows me what the terrain of an area looks like. And of course, I'm not obligated to keep it as is. I can add an island or take out an island or add some elevation or whatever I want. But I don't use any apps. I'm like you, Will. I'm old school. I use a word processing program. But to the extent that I use an electronic or online tool, I'd say Google Maps is the main one that I end up using just month to month.
How about you, Brendan?
Well, good question, because I'm an IT professional. So I use a lot of the same tools that I use when I'm starting up a new project or working on a new app or working on a new website. I like mind maps a whole lot. Mind maps don't necessarily work well for some people because they don't think that way, but especially if you are a fan of starting off with a what-if question, that's your central concept, and then you build your web of ideas out from there. By the time you've populated your web of ideas, for example, you start with your what if questions, then you branch it off into, socioeconomic problems, you branch it off into government problems, you branch it off into, scientific problems, and you work out from there, right? Yep. So then you answer all of your scientific questions. What does that mean for science? What does that mean for socioeconomic? What does that mean for politics and so on? And once you get out, by the time you're done building that mind map, you can either write it up formally if you want, or not, because it doesn't really matter unless you plan on publishing it, which some of us do. Unless you plan on publishing it, by the time you finish that mind map, I think you've figured out your game world enough effectively to make it work. So there's apps like FreeMind and things like that that are good. Also, you can't go wrong with Evernote or other clipping tools like that. Evernote's got plugins for your browser, so you'll be reading things on the internet. You're on your favorite gaming-related website, say, I don't know, as an example, d-infinity.net, and on that favorite gaming-related website, you see something clever from a clever author, like, I don't know, Michael Varhola, and he wrote something that you would like to incorporate, so you clip that and you save it for later, and then you combine all your notes later. So that's good for finding inspiration. And then once you've found your inspiration, you can go to your mind map, build out your mind map, and you're usually good to go. I tend to do that with my projects. I'm fairly successful doing that. It works also for world building, so you might give that a try as far as apps or software. That might be a good place to start.
And how about you, Joe?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat with you. I think I don't really use that much in the way of software. I think the extent of my software use is probably internet research. If I want to know if I'm designing a particular area and I want to base it on some real-world location, maybe I want to look up historical data, or I want to look up rainfall for particular climates or weather patterns, or steel phases of the moon, so I don't have to come up with it, that sort of thing.
Very cool. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a really good, really meaty discussion on world building. We will be signing off soon, but before we do that, I just wanted to go around the room and have everybody give their final thoughts on world building before we sign off. And my final thought is I'm just going to touch one more time on the idea that your world should not make too much sense. if you look back at human history is riddled with continuity errors, and it's very sloppy. You can tell that we've been making it up as we've gone along, and have been very unsuccessful in our attempts to revise it later after the fact. So I really feel like your campaign setting, your world, if you want it to feel real, should have the same things. It should have things that feel anomalous, from which you can build adventures and places to explore. There's no answer more boring than, oh, well, I put this in the campaign setting because it just made sense. Well, just making sense isn't fun. Chaos is where the stuff starts getting fun. The bizarre is where the stuff stops getting fun. Don't be too sensible with your world design. How about you, Mike? Final thoughts.
Just peripheral to world building, I would just remind our listeners that D Infinity Volume number 6 is going to be coming out next week. It's got a bunch of neat features in it related to world building. One is a preview of Lives of Coast. So we've got 12 biographies, including ones by you and Brendan, I believe. And that's going to release ones by Brendan, if not ones by you. It's also got a really good piece of fiction by Clint Staples called Their Blood is the Sea. And I would say that it interprets Dark Ages Europe in mythos terms. So there's just a lot of great material in D Infinity Volume number 6, The Mythos. It'll be available on Drive-Thru-RPG in PDF format as of next week, and in print format at Comicpalooza. I'd encourage people to check that out.
Excellent. And Brendan, your final thought.
So, now that all of our viewers have watched the show, I encourage them to start with the what if you didn't have D Infinity Live to offer you all of these tips on building worlds. It'd be terrible, wouldn't it? So then you should be sharing it with your friends. So let them know about the show. People must already be doing that because we have more people tuning in every week, which is excellent. It's very encouraging for us as an entire team. It gives us the opportunity to bring in fancy guests like Joe because they look at us and they don't think we're super lame. So keep sharing it. Keep tuning in. We'll keep doing our thing. Hopefully we keep getting better at what we're doing as well, because I'm getting lots of practice running my mouth. And yeah, that's my final word on world building. Build the world of D Infinity Live by sharing it with the people you know and love.
Very cool. And Joe, as our special guest, we're going to give you the last word.
All right. Well, my last word is, if you're having trouble thinking of how to build your world or getting inspiration, why don't you come to Comicpalooza and talk to some people that do it for a living, like Michael Varhola or some of our other guests, Adam Daigle, Owen Stevens, both working for Paizo now. We've got local game developers as well. Kevin Nunn, Kevin Bruschi. We've got Ross Watson, Michael, of course, William.
Lucas Purier, he will be running darn it, he's got his own system. It's Sagas of something, Sagas of Old, something like that. He's going to be running a number of games of that, and he's from Dallas, so he is a Texas game developer.
And we've got Jason Yarnell of D3 Adventures there also. So, I mean, there's plenty of people you can talk to about world building, plenty of RPGs you can try out. You can find some inspiration.
Very cool. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are very glad you stuck with our show tonight, and we will see you all next week when our topic will be swords and sorcery, and I've got to say, it is about damn time.
But I used my A material tonight. You son of a bitch, you didn't tell me that's what the topic was next week.
And with that, Michael, you have had your full 5 minutes of hate on the show. Bye, everybody.
Bye.